Hello, this is Dr. Dave Masnak talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. So what I'm going to talk to you about in this video are the costs and benefits of organizational learning and maybe some advantages and disadvantages of a learning organization. So what I'm going to get into is, go and talk to you about what a learning organization is. So I'm actually a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and this is my main field, theoretical field of interest. So I find it really fascinating. I've been studying this for 10 years now, and I think that there's lots to say, and this video is not going to cover nearly as much that should be covered. And then I'll get into sort of briefly what is organizational learning theory, and then get into, what's some of the key components with organizational learning. I probably have forgotten some. And then maybe, along the way, talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of being a learning organization, because I don't think that there's lots of people really talking about this in the general public. So I think this is pretty interesting. So what is a learning organization? Well, this is really what you're trying to do with a learning organization is create an organization that has its core, the core aspect of the organization is not really centered around a particular product or service, but it's really centered around this ability to learn. So it's built into the culture, right? So you might be actually building a particular product or service, but what you're trying to do is create a culture and create an organization that it doesn't matter what the product is that you are selling. And if the environment changes and if the world changes all of a sudden, new technology comes in, that you can adapt and try something differently very rapidly and very quickly. So what this allows you to do in the long run, it allows you, and it's not in the short run. So in the long run, it allows you to remain competitive, allowing you to compete against other organizations, other businesses, and survive in the long run. So what do I mean by competition? A couple of key terms here. What do I mean by organizations? Generally, the popular press tends to talk about companies or firms, private companies, public companies, that kind of stuff, and generally focusing on public companies. But this could be really wide ranging. And in fact, the roots of most of this knowledge and what we study actually comes from understanding like public organizations, like bureaucracies and churches and things like that, that are focused less on the commercial enterprises and more so on sort of big um, government agencies and things like that. That's the roots, but it's changed over the years. Now we've focused on in strategy, we focus a lot more. There is um, an overt focus on Fortune 500 public companies, and that's probably a little bit to the detriment of our field, but people are recognizing that now. We've in the last 10, 15 years, we've been studying a lot of entrepreneurial companies and small companies and things like that. So, and it's changed our understanding quite a bit. So, what are some examples of um, what are examples of some learning organizations? I think there's a couple of good ones that are making some unique moves. So one of them, and these are just, these are large public companies because everybody knows them. One of them is Netflix. They have a really ruthless culture in that they're constantly focused on improvement. And if you're not part of improving the organization in some way, they will let you go. And that is part of a learning organization, right? If you're going to focus on that, there is some selection that happens, right? Personnel selection, and sometimes you might need somebody, and sometimes you don't, and it might come into the organization and leave. One of them that is different and has a little bit less of that kind of culture is Google, and they are really unique because they are exploring really big bets, and they do things that is really sort of classic in terms of some of the understanding that we have with organizational learning. So, for example, figuring out whether you should pick a sort of simple bet, one that you know about that has pretty good returns, which is their search, versus one that is really novel and really has uncertain returns, probably not going to make you any money in the next 10 years, but they're still trying those anyways, and that would be those big bets that they have, right? Like Calico is one of them, which is they're focused on, the science of treating aging as a disease. Other ones like the car, autonomous car, right? Things like that that are really different, unique, and they don't really add any value. They're in fact just a pure cost center at this moment for the organization. But they know the reason why they're doing that is because they're trying to move into the next kind of environment when search no longer is profitable. And you have to think about that, right? Like, how are you going to move from one thing to the next? And that's really what the learning organization does. And one thing that's built into their culture allows you to try things that are that allow you to lead to failure, and it's celebrated. So it's really cool to have that built into the culture. So what is organizational learning theory? So that is where you're focused on. So we study how organizations actually create, retain, and transfer knowledge between firms and as well as within firms. And so it could come from individuals, it could come from the routines that the organization has, it could come from their culture, could come from, so outside of the organization, could be the institutions, right? So government institutions help organizations learn all the time. I study what goes on in the FDA, and that's definitely one organization that is really focused on learning, and they're an amazing organization that way. It could be from other companies of what's called vicarious learning, looking at other companies that are doing wonderful things and trying to imitate what they are doing or maybe not doing, right? So trying to avoid what other companies are doing. That there is a lot to understand this area. I've been studying it for 10 years, and there's still a lot more to understand. So one thing that we do know is what learning could potentially look like. This doesn't say it is uniform across all organizations, but generally what you're going to see is what is called a learning curve. And this is pretty universal with individuals and organizations. And what it is organizations improve with they improve at a diminishing rate with accumulated experience. So we've seen this, and it's also called the progress curve if you don't know. The reason why some people prefer progress curve is because it doesn't have the annotation of learning, because sometimes the learning is an ambiguous word. It's hard to, anyways. So if you do something to a large enough extent and you do that repeatedly and it's fairly simple enough, then what you're going to do is actually improve with experience. It's going to the improvement is going to decrease at a decreasing rate. So, or improve at a decreasing rate, depending on what you're looking at. So that's the key thing, and that's what a pattern you're going to look at, and it's kind of just an exponential curve, either going up like this if you're looking at performance, or the rate of failures that a firm will have, it's decreasing over time. So what are components of organizational learning? Well, you might need organizational memory, for example. This is where you accumulate, and I have a video on that too, where you accumulate knowledge and you have to store it, and then you have to figure out how to retrieve that knowledge. There's also knowledge acquisition, so how you are creating an organization to look to see at what other people are doing and what you're doing within the firm, and trying to figure out how to actually store that or see, spot, like scanning the environment, spotting things that are really useful for your organization. Then there's also, you have to figure out how to actually apply and implement this knowledge. One thing that we do know is that most knowledge is actually very tacit. It is stored, so tacit being it's invisible, you can't put your finger on it. It's not codified in any sort of way. It's not written down in instructions. And you have to somehow figure out how to transfer that and figure out how somebody else has all this tacit knowledge, how you can transfer it to somebody else. It's not easy to do. It's really difficult, to be honest. Another thing that we do know is that if you store more knowledge and you accumulate more knowledge, you're going to be able to make sense of the world a lot more. It's called absorption capacity, and be able to bring in more knowledge as you do this. So uh, this this is why learning is great, right? This is why individuals in school, the more knowledge that they accumulate, the more opportunities they start seeing for things around them. Um, it's the same thing in organizations. They will do the same thing. The more that you focus on accumulating knowledge and focus on a learning organization, the better it is that you're going to see other opportunities around you. So there is some disadvantages. Actually, there's there's a lot of advantages, but there's lots of disadvantages with the learning organization that we know about. We've been studying this for a long time. In fact, a lot of the theory that we have sort of focuses on the disadvantages. A couple of them is it's really hard to figure out causal mechanisms of what's going on in an organization. So you might not figure out what to do, or you might learn the wrong lessons because you don't understand the causal mechanism. And I do have some videos on that if you want to check those out. The other thing, and what's this called, is superstitious learning. The other thing that could possibly happen is that you are creating a culture that is kind of ruthless, where you're kind of disregarding humans and people. So you focus on the learning so much that you don't necessarily care about having a culture where people come into the organization and they stay there. That's one thing that you have to be careful about. Now, Google does a good they have a good sort of culture with figuring this out, in that they celebrate failure and things like that. But if you don't celebrate it and you are being too literal when something fails or something breaks, and so one of the ways that we actually improve is by removing things that don't work very well, and sort of try to remove those things that don't work really well, and then reinforcing the successful things that work well. And if you remove those things, like somebody that's not working very well in your organization, that can have profound impacts on the culture, right? So people start not being comfortable with making mistakes or trying big things, right? They get kind of risk averse to a large degree in the organization. And another thing that's really tricky is we don't understand, people are really bad at understanding the differences between immediate rewards and long-term rewards. Most people are very myopic, and most companies are very myopic, and they don't see long-term rewards very well. So they're not going to choose alternatives that have a long-term possibly gain, but and they're going to focus on that or avoid those things and just focus on the things that are really simple and that's going to be profitable in the near term, which can harm you substantially in the long run, but be a complete benefit in the short term. So you have to, it's like, so for example, it might be like eating that piece of cake. It feels great in the short term to eat that piece of cake, but if you eat too many pieces of cake, it's very harmful in the long run. So that's the things that there's trade-offs that we make, and there's lots of sort of disadvantages if you're taking it too literally and focusing on being a learning organization too much. But it's all in the culture. It's all in who you hire to make this thing work. It's a really tricky thing. There's a real fine balance to create a learning organization that it has the right culture, that people are okay with making some of these decisions going forward. So that's all I'm going to talk about. You can look at some of the other videos. I got lots of stuff on all this kind of stuff. So go check it out in the Reciprocity YouTube channel. The E is written with a 3. Give me a thumbs up as well, and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you like these videos. Thank you so much. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.